everybody. My name is Ian, and I am continuing an illustration that I started and showed in a previous video, the composition video, where I just talked about creating the initial composition of a painting, all the various steps I use when I'm just doing the layout, and that layout ended up looking like this with the main robot figure seated, integrated into this scene of the corner of Portage and Main here in Winnipeg. Now that this piece is done, I want to get into talking about how I go about painting it, and specifically my process of painting it from back to front. Now, I always start with the elements of the illustration furthest away from the viewer and moving it forward in space to the primary focus of the illustration. Generally, that is the closest to the viewer, but really, even if I'd had the primary focus in the middle ground, then I would be doing everything around that figure first, or around that point of interest first, and leave the central point of interest for last. The follow-up step was to lay down these flat colored layers, which I didn't do on camera this time. If you're interested in seeing this particular process, there are other videos of mine in this illustration discussion series where I've talked about that. But basically, each individual color here is a separate layer. So if I switch over to showing this, we can see currently I'm on the background layer. If I scroll all the way up, that's how many layers I'm playing with at the moment. But I'm going to be introducing a lot more special effects layers going between these particular layers. So just like I talk about painting from back to front, from the perspective of working in Photoshop, I'm painting from the bottom to the top, because this background layer will end up being the element that's furthest back. Or like I talked about in the previous video, this is all being painted on my Huion Kamvas Pro 16 2.5K, 16-inch screen, 2.5K resolution. This is not a touch screen, so I can have my hand on this all I want. Nothing will happen. It only interacts with the stylus itself. The line art that I was just showing here only exists on a channel. So if you're using a different program than something other than Photoshop, something that doesn't use channels, I would have this suspended on a separate layer above everything else, but then would not show it in the final version. It wouldn't be in the final printed version of the illustration. And you can see that if I printed it like this, there is no line art. But I turn the channel on so that I can see what my original illustration was. For the most part, that's not going to matter very much because I have this now laid out in the various layers. Essentially, the edges of those layers are functioning as the line art. So I have actually the background sky and the windows in those two buildings in the background all in the same layer. So you know what, I'm going to go ahead and paint it like that. So choosing a different blue that I want to paint. I'm going to go with the same basic color scheme from the original background photo, which I'm showing here, dealing with cool backgrounds and warm foregrounds. The original lighting in the piece does have a strong blue sky. The buildings themselves are skewed a little bit cooler. There's a slightly orange-brown building in the background. I'm going to go with that basic paint scheme, but I'm going to tweak it so it's a little bit cooler. And then in the foreground, I'll be making it a little bit yellower, a little bit warmer than it is in the actual the actual reference photograph, so that I'm dealing with the notion, the one aspect of color theory, where things further away from the viewer are cooler and less saturated. So skewing, in this case, bluer with less color, and things that are closer to the viewer are warmer and more saturated. So dealing with the deep background and those windows, dealing with kind of a sky blue, and I'm going to use a gradient tool to create a lighter blue and grad up into this a lighter blue, and I'm going to go even lighter than that with my paintbrush tool. For the most part, the brushes I use for both the painting, the initial layout, and for most of the painting, um, are just the basic round brushes that come with Photoshop and most painting programs. Whether it's a hard edge for painting or a softer edge to give it more of an airbrush look, I tend to just go with those. However, I did create a series of more organic looking brushes for doing things like background skies and fog patterns and things like that. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I don't like overworking skies, but I still want to give it a bit of a sense of it being a cloudy day. Now I want to isolate the windows, so you quickly use the lasso tool, and I'm going to brush some of that darker blue back in there. So that pulls them a little bit forward in space. Not only are they going to be reflecting the clouds and the sky itself, but they're also going to be reflecting the buildings in the vicinity. So at this point, I want to grab one of the colors of one of the buildings that I will be using later, much more of a neutral color, and then switching back to a round brush. Paint in the rough shape of another building. In this case, the Richardson building that's directly in front of this one, into this window pattern. I'm doing it lightly. I still want to have a sense of it being reflective and picking up other colors in the environment. And I don't want to over render the windows here either, but at least give it some sense of depth, some sense that there is more to the city than just the corner that we're seeing now, but it's going to be reflecting other parts of the city. I like using the color sliders here at the top of my tools there to create colors in Photoshop. This illustration is being painted in RGB, but I'm using the CMYK color sliders. Basically, from working in comics for so long, comic book pages are, for the most part, done in CMYK, and there are comic printing services that ask you, even if you painted your original in RGB, that you convert the file to CMYK for proper printing. And the suggestion of detail in these buildings being reflected in the reflections of these buildings. And before I go to the next step, I actually want to put in a shadow being cast onto these windows from the structure of the building itself. I know that my primary light source will be coming from the left-hand side, from the right-hand side of frame, from above. So that means I would want to put in a bit of a shadow on the right-hand side of these windows, where the building extends in front of the glass. That's the deep background and those windows completed. I'll move on to another series of buildings. When possible, I work from dark to light. I will generally put in the darkest color that I want to work with, and then paint in my lighter colors on top of that. And here I'm going to put that line art back on again, just so I can follow roughly what I had done originally in my original sketch. Now these layers are locked. What does that mean? When I created each of these individual painting layers, I then used the lock function in Photoshop. There are similar functions in other painting programs. IBIS Paint X has the alpha lock, which works exactly the same way. And basically it means um, if I am painting over that particular layer, only that layer is affected. Like right now I'm using the round paintbrush over top of this. Nothing outside of that layer is being affected. The sky is not being affected. The building in front of it is not being affected. And generally, there will be times that I want painting effects to go over top both that layer and other layers. When I want to do that, I'll create a separate layer on top of everything else, rather than have things on that particular layer bleed into each other. So I have this building on the left-hand side that is actually facing south. But on the same layer, directly in front of it, I have another building where this portion of it is facing west. So I'm going to have those be two slightly different painting techniques, slightly different colors. There are actually columns on this side of the building. I can actually create some darker shadows in there where the columns are. Now, these are all roughly the same painting techniques working digitally as I would be using if I was painting with acrylics. It's actually a very similar process from when I've done acrylic painting. Generally just a lot less to clean up. I don't want to do too much detail on the columns. I want it to have a hint of them being columns, but not... if I put in too much detail, then that'll actually pull focus away from the main character. And a bit of painting texture into this building just to give the hint of the brick pattern. Okay, so with that done, I go on to my next building, which I've now filled in the same way I did the first series of buildings with black. And we'll then pick you up more colors to paint in. In reality, this building here is a bit warmer. So I'm going to start with that. But I want to make it a little bit cooler. I want to make the color in a little bit cooler than it is in real life, just to continue the notion of the background being cooler and the foreground being warmer. And again, I'm not putting in a ton of detail on these buildings really far in the background. I want to give the sense of there being more detail. And then if your eye focused back there, there would be a lot more information, a lot more visual information. Then let's move forward in space to this much more prominent building. And I'm going to alternate back and forth between painting in shadows and painting in highlights on this building. There's actually a lot of detail on this building, a lot of raised elements to it. I want to make sure I capture at least the sense of that, if not every single little detail. Because again, it would be very easy for me to focus on the details on this building to the extent that I would actually be pulling focus away from the main character. And I don't want to do that. Ultimately, this illustration is about the main character. The story being told is about her, not about the building. So you can see already how the pattern of this building is starting to appear. One thing I'm trying to keep in mind, one thing I want to keep doing, is I'm not finishing the painting of any one section of window. I don't want to do that all at once and then have to repeat that over and over. Instead, I'm building up the same elements on each window. Like I'll add in a particular type of shadow to one window and then repeat that throughout the entire building, and then go back and add a different highlight and add that same highlight to all the windows. I find that if I was to complete all the rendering, doing all the pattern of light and shadow in one particular section, and then go to the next set of windows and do all that work again, and then do all that work again, um, I will. It'll create some bad habits. I'll end up missing something, or the later, I think more importantly, the later windows will start to lose detail. So the pattern will be inconsistent. Whereas if I do it this way, while it will look a little bit different from each window to each window, which it should, because those are inhabiting different spaces, different places in space, in three-dimensional space. So the light is hitting it slightly differently. It will look more consistent. It'll look more like the same set of windows. It's a similar issue that you can have when drawing a human figure. If you start with the hand and then draw the arm and then draw the shoulder and build it up that way, you actually run the risk of the scale being wrong over the entire figure because you're just concentrating on each individual element, but just finishing each one of those elements. And you'll end up with one hand will be a different size than the other. One arm will be a different size, one leg, things like that. Each of the individual elements may look really, really cool, but you'll find the figure as a whole does not look consistent. Now, if your intent is to draw a more monstrous looking figure, that's actually a pretty cool drawing exercise. That might be an interesting thing to do, actually. Deliberately go into uh, drawing, intending to draw a normal looking figure, but drawing it with that method where you just draw each individual bit. You just concentrate on each individual portion of the person, and then find out later when you've completed it that all the proportions are wrong, all the scales wrong everywhere. But as like a more, Halloween is coming up. I'm doing this at the beginning of September. That would actually be a fun exercise for creating individuals who look a little off. But if your intent is to make them look like normal people, quote unquote normal people, then you're better off. Certainly, you start with the arm and go to the leg, but you don't finish the arm. You outline the hand, you outline the arm, you do all your outlining to begin with, because then you could immediately see if your scale is wrong. And it's easier to fix that at the outlining stage, at a much earlier stage than later on. Let's go to the next one. So with this building, I am going to put down my guides because there is text here that I want to recreate. There is a restaurant on this corner. Now, if I was doing this as an illustration, as say an advertisement for this restaurant back here, I would want to make sure that the lettering was very clear, very precise. But like the rest of the deep background, I want to keep it a little fuzzy, so I'm not pulling too much focus from the main character. So I'm going to quickly sketch in this text based on what I had originally done. Keeping it a bit fuzzy because these are raised letters sitting out from the side of the building, so they're also casting a shadow. But the letters are in black and the shadow is in black. So if I start with them being a little bit fuzzy, they already create the sense of there being a shadow. But now I'm going to just rough in a bit of a shadow. I would say that these are like metal letters sitting out approximately a foot away. So I now have one plane of the deep background done. The building in front of all this, that's currently basically kind of an orangey pink. that is the Richardson building, I want that to be sitting just a little bit in front of everything else. So I'm going to add a special effects layer here that's going to go over top of everything I just painted, casting a bit of a blue light over all of that. This will serve to push everything that I've just painted even further away from the main character, and also uh, give it a bit more of this of the same blue color scheme. It won't overwrite everything I've done. I'm not going to make it that strong, but so I've created another layer here called FX001. I tend to label all of my effects layers just FX followed by a number, but not necessarily specifying what kind of effects layer they are. That procedure works for me. But for this one, I'm going to set it to screen. Basically, this means it's going to be stripping away colors that I don't want. So I'm going to choose, honestly, I'm going to choose a really, really rich blue, use the gradient tool, and grad over the whole thing. And you see, it didn't actually take that dark blue color and just drop it on top of the line art, the painting. Instead, it strips away everything that isn't that color. But using a gradient tool, it only does it just so much. Does it more in the upper right-hand corner than it did in the lower left, because that was the direction that I did the gradient tool. Since the deep background, since the sky itself is primarily blue, in fact, primarily lighter than the color I used, it didn't get affected at all. But some of the other colors in those buildings did, and it gradually got stripped away. So if you see, this is what it looked like before I did that effects layer, and this is what it looks like afterwards. My neutral colors are still there. The other colors I was painting with are still there. There are still elements of the warmer tones, but now they've all been affected by this blue effect, this assisting in pushing elements back. This is another way to really differentiate what you're doing from the reference photo that you've taken. So I like how that turned out. And I'm going to go on to the next section. First, I'll just put down a blue. Now, this side of the Richardson building, the building I'm painting right now, is actually in deep shadow. And in my reference photo, those windows are pretty much black. I could leave it that dark. But because it established a little bit of a more purple light coming from the west side, I kind of want to put that purple light into the Richardson building as well. Continuing with my theme of the background being cooler than the foreground. So I took a slightly more purple blue as my base color, and now I'm going to grab this lighter color up into it, and then I'm going to hand paint a little bit of that as though it's coming up from below, as though this light is being reflected off of other buildings. But then I do want to go back and add in reflections from other buildings. By the way, you can see these other purple shapes in front of it. Those are other poles and things like that sitting in front of the building. Those are on a separate layer. This painting isn't affecting that at all. Okay, so I filled in the color on the ridges of the building, the basic black that I'll be painting with. But I'm going to go back to my Windows layer, and just like what I did with the other Windows layers, I'm actually going to paint in how there is a shadow on each one of these windows. Now to paint the actual building. Use some of the same purpley colors, which will serve to separate it from the buildings behind it, but not too much. I'm going to add in an additional lighting effect. Another effects layer set to screen. And just like before, I'm going to be using a very dark blue. There we go. Kind of push everything a little bit further into the background. Now we're getting into those lampposts. Don't need to do a lot with these. In fact, for the most part, I'll just be blending in some of my darker background colors. Although, this lamppost here does have a few elements that are glass. So I want to play with the lighting, the pattern of light and shadow on those. Now, technically, all of them have these, but you can't see all of it necessarily. So there's several reasons why I paint from back to front. This is one of them is making sure that I'm not adding too much detail into the background, not overdoing that to keep the focus on the main character. So I consistently do not overdo the amount of detail. Okay, we have a traffic light here. So obviously, even with changing the color schemes, traffic lights are still a certain color. I'm skewing it towards blue, but I'm still ultimately going to make it a yellow-orange traffic light. I'm starting with kind of this brownish color, and then painting in brighter colors. It's being affected by light coming from the right-hand side of frame. I'm just going to keep adding color and adding light. Now, right now, it's standing out as being very yellow. The actual color isn't quite that yellow. And I will be putting one of those gradient blue effects over top of it as well later, which will then tweak it back a little bit. Actually, because there's a few other things back here I want to tweak, I'm going to do an additional FX layer in order to put that sign on there. I want to add a bit more character to this tree. It's looking a little too abstract. So again, this is part of where I'm using reality as an inspiration. There is a tree here, and it does more or less look like this, but I'm adding a touch more contrast. So if I do it so it's a little bit purpler, that will change the ridges in building to being slightly more purple, which is what I'd originally wanted. And it's affecting this just a little bit. There we go. Now let's move on to the street. So, like with all the other steps, start by painting it black. I had begun putting in a more neutral, slightly warmer tone on the side of the sidewalk. So I'm going to do that here as well. Basically just grab that same color and we'll now paint that in, but I'm going to go a bit brighter. The pink on top of the street will actually be turned white. That is, those are white lines painted directly onto the street. Now if that's done, the first layer, the rearmost layer of vehicles. This vehicle back here is blue. I'm gonna go with blue. Or am I? Yeah, I'm gonna go with purple. There we go. I'll actually grab in a purple. It's a very strong purple. I will be tweaking it as I go along. For simplicity's sake, I put that on the same layer as all the windows and wheels and such on the layer of vehicles in front of it. I'll be painting those separately. Now the paint on these cars is also reflective, also glossy. And then I have a Manitoba license plate. This next vehicle up here in real life is a charcoal. I'm actually going to go with a green picked up roughly from this tree back here. Now, I'm going to pull back on that green. Not make it quite so prominent. But I do want to vary the colors a little bit, but not a lot. This is me definitely taking reality as inspiration, but not have it be mandatory. I mean, you do these kind of distortions, if you're doing it one on top of the other, you can go kind of crazy because you're going to then be putting in other elements on top. Having done that deep background inside the windscreen, I'm now going to do the interior of the car. But it's setting up this nice sense of depth without having to spend too much time on it. Let's go with kind of a red. I don't want to make it shockingly red. I don't want to make it like too crazy of a red color because I want I don't want it to pull, like I keep repeating, I don't want it to pull too much focus away from the main character and from her warmer color scheme. I have to be careful with this one. I'm also going to incorporate colors in the environment, starting with this basic red. I actually like to pull in some blue because it is a curved surface. I can pull in blues from behind it, so showing that it is a three-dimensional object curved in three-dimensional space. There are blue things behind it that will affect color of the car. Now that we have the deep background and those vehicles completed, I'm going to get into the lampposts right behind her, starting with the traffic lights. I'm going to start with the color of the traffic lights that I used in the deep background, but I'm going to make them a bit warmer, a bit more saturated. Just going to want to lay down, this is the rough idea, but then make it a little bit purer. A little bit more yellow, in fact. Now this signage up at the very top, very steel colored. The signage at the bottom are actually the street signs where they'll say Portage and Main. But the two parts in the middle will be the same color scheme as the traffic light. Now I would like to put in a bit of a neutral color from the left-hand side of frame to give a bit of a three-dimensional quality. These traffic lights, not going to go full on blue or anything like that. Not here anyway, I don't want to have that much contrast when I'm still this far back in the illustration. Now I'm putting in the light coming from the left-hand side of frame, bouncing onto these street lights. But I also want to put a reflection from the central post, from the central street lamp into this as well. And then let's do a quick pass on the lamppost. In real life, the lamppost is very gray, very much a cool gray. So a gray that shifts towards blue. However, because I have the background so heavily blue, I think I want to make it a little bit more of a neutral gray, so that it pulls a little bit forward to the frame, but not a ton, just to basically delineate that it is further forward in space. I'm actually going to cast a bit of a shadow onto it from this sign, but I want to leave that for a bit. I want to put in the brighter colors first, and then go back and paint in a bit of a shadow. Partly so that I don't make the shadow too dark. I want to see how bright I end up making the lamppost first. I'm going to reflect some of the color of these traffic signals into the lamppost, into this these posts coming off of the lamppost. Because they are metallic, they will reflect back and forth. Now we have these other posts that are receding off into the background. Now I actually have the posts, those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 posts sitting on a layer above the sidewalk, but I'd like to get them painted in first. Now in reality they are very black, but I want to drop down that intensity a bit. Later on I might ramp it back up, but for right now I don't really want to go too much darker than what I'm doing here. Well, the fact that our character is actually leaning against this first post should make it a little bit darker in places. I do want to make sure it's darker than the other posts behind it or the cars, so it stands out. But it still doesn't go quite as... I want to leave room on the main character to go even darker. Now we're moving on to the foreground, onto the sidewalks underneath the robot character. And here we're going to get into much warmer tones, a lot more yellows and oranges. But I will be using some blues and cooler colors in the cast shadow behind the character. In the original photo, this really goes to white, but I'm not going to go that extreme. In fact, I want there to be a lot of warmer tones than that. So using my grad tool, begin with this basic color and then paint in a lot more light. Now the basic light pattern is almost exactly from the left side of frame towards the right. The original photo I had taken would have been early afternoon. The sun was quite high in the sky. It's not casting super long shadows. I think I'm going to make them a little bit longer in this. Specifically so I can create a nice shadow pattern underneath the robot character. But anywhere where she's touching the ground, those will be the darkest points in the cast shadow on the ground. Now I'm not using any pre-rendered textures for this sidewalk. I want to do it all by hand. All the little pits and brushing and whatnot. I just want to have that as a completely hand-rendered. There is kind of a brushed effect on the sidewalk. Almost like the brushed aluminum effect you see on the Iron Man armor in the very first Iron Man movie. I had said that I want to have the cast shadow skew a little bit blue. I'm going to start painting that bluer color in. Basically painting in the opposing color of the warm tone that I'm using. But it'll also have the effect of slightly reflecting the base colors of the metallic robot. The next element I want to work on is her phone, with very similar colors to what I'm using on the sidewalk. Skewed a little bit more orange, I think. I think I'm going to go with a red for the main part of her phone. Now I'm going to grab in a very dramatic red, but then I'm going to pull back on just how shockingly red that is. Now her fingertips, or her fingers, are casting quite a bit of shadow onto the surface of the phone as well, which is something I need to bring into the outside part that I first started with. But first, I want to paint it as though the fingers are not there, and then paint the shadow onto it. So let's grab the hair layer, just like everything else. Put down the darkest shadow color first. Actually, it might be interesting to bring in the sort of gold orange color from the phone into her hair. Yeah, playing with this kind of goldish color initially on the hair. Only let's go to a much brighter reflective color than I was even using on the phone. Still using, basically I'm taking the highlight on the phone and using that as my mid-tone. This purple will function in much the same way as an opposing color will for shadows, as a way to create more of a sense of mass, of the three-dimensional quality, but won't be quite the same color as everything behind her. So her hair won't fall into the background. She'll still stand out from it. I'm also wondering about, for depth, about adding another shadow in the deep foreground from an object that's off panel, say another post or a person. I think that might actually be a good idea. Further pushing the focus back now up towards the main character. Because currently, with the way that I'm going from the cool colors to the warm colors, it draws the eye down towards the sidewalk, and I'd kind of like to push it back up a little bit to make sure that it'll be focused on the main character. I can add a little bit of extra detail onto this shadow. I think I'd actually like to put some elements of this red from the phone into her hair. I don't plan on using any red on the main character, like on the actual metal plating of the main character. So this will make her hair stand out a little bit more. Now, I'm not going to put in a lot of it, but I would like to suggest the idea of there being this red tone in her hair. These two colors, or having this one color repeating itself on the character, having both her phone and her hair, will actually tell us a little bit more about the character. With that added in, let's get into painting, starting the painting on the main character. So starting with my topmost layer, I'm actually going to sample the warm tone that I have on the sidewalk, but then use a more saturated color. Now right away, this orange, looking a little bit more orange than what I'm necessarily wanting. It'd be too easy to get that very close to a skin tone that I'm not really wanting. Let's back off on that a little bit. A little bit more of a yellow. Like with the sidewalk, the primary light source on her is coming from the right side of frame and slightly above. So that's how I'm beginning the painting of all these metal plates and metal segments. And we're still dealing with the mid-tone. I'm still going to be going a lot brighter eventually with this. But for now, this is to create the basic shape. These metal plates follow the contours of the body, but they are also independent shapes themselves. So they'll curve around what human musculature would be, but they actually curve a little bit more because for many of these plates, because these plates themselves are curved objects, so they have a bit of a curved edge. So I want to keep that in mind as I'm doing this as well. Now her leg will be casting a shadow on her torso as well. For now, I want to deal primarily, like I was doing with my first pass on the sidewalk, dealing with the main highlight, dealing with the main light source, and then painting back some shadow. But I would also like to start including how on the plates I've been working on already, there will still be cast shadows. So let's get into adding some of those right now. I'm not going to go quite as blue, quite as cool as these shadows will end up being later. But for now, I'd like to put in the suggestion of them. Now, things like this portion here are what I'm talking about when I'm referring to these individual plates being independent structures themselves, how they curve at the edges. I actually want to put a bit of a shadow on the underside of this plate to show that the plates themselves curve in space, so they have a bit more structure than just following the underlying musculature. Now her right arm will almost be, you can see from the shadow on the ground, will actually be almost itself completely in shadow because her body is blocking that primary light source. I will eventually be adding a lot more contrast onto that gem thing, the base of her neck. I'm going to leave that for later because that part's not metal like the rest of her. That is actually a glass or crystals type gem, something I've been adding into this design lately. Now, even though I'm painting the mid-tone of the warmer side on the figure, I am brushing in some of the much, much darker tones for the side of the figure that's facing away from that light source, just so I can keep working with the three-dimensional form of the figure. Have my first pass on that mid-tone. Now I'll start putting in a bit of a brighter color, and be sure to remember my pattern of light and shadow and use that already from the previous layer so that it all looks like it's on the same figure, even though these are separate metal plates that are themselves three-dimensional objects suspended in space. Painting back a bit of shadow onto the nose, into the side of the face. I'll likely end up softening some of these painting selections using a softer edge brush later on. But I don't want to go too soft just yet, because basically that gives me some room to maneuver with wanting to add in the softer selections. So I'm painting some of this blue secondary light into her left leg, the part that's in the shadow. But I'm also going to end up painting some of the warm light back up into it, being reflected off of her torso. But I'll leave that until later when I have a better sense of how all these various metal plates are integrating and interacting with each other. Plus, then there's going to be the shadow from that leg being cast onto the torso. And I go very high contrast with the nails already. I'll be carrying that through to the toenails later. So far, the coloring in this is a little bit more matte, a little bit more muted than I'm wanting it to be. But right now, that is okay. Concentrating mostly on just getting the shadow pattern in the figure. The character's also looking a little bit floaty. She's kind of looking like she's floating above the ground rather than actually part of the scene and connected to the ground. So I want to make sure, let's start here. I want to have the shadow under her go a bit darker, go much closer to the darker tones on her. We're getting a little bit closer to having her feel like she's actually in the environment. Now I can bring in some of this blue color into the shadow being cast across her torso as well. Just a little bit of it. And once again, as she is touching this post behind her, I want to bring in a slightly darker shadow color there as well. So now I have the basic pattern of light and dark laid down on the main character, incorporating colors from the environment, which for me is fundamentally the biggest reason why I paint from back to front. When I've got the basic pattern down, that's when I go in and do a lot more tight details and really start polishing the whole thing up, which winds up with a layer looking like this. So we've got a lot more precise details going on. Everything's a lot smoother, not quite as rough as it was here. Starting to bring in even more details from the background being reflected into the main character. This happens whether the character is metallic or not. Almost all surfaces are reflective one way or another. And if somebody, for example, is wearing a very bright red jacket and they're leaning against a wall, that red will actually be a color being cast onto the wall. If you don't have it appearing on the wall, it'll seem a little bit unnatural. We always have a certain amount. There will always be a certain amount of light being reflected from us back into our environment, from the central character into their environment, just as the color and light from the environment is being reflected on them. So that's the kind of thing I would want to be looking at, whether I was working on a metallic character or not. Now, the reflections are a lot more extreme here due to the very reflective character, nature of the character, the materials they're made out of. But yeah, we have a lot more detail now, a lot brighter highlights. I want to go a little bit brighter on some of it, but I do have the basic pattern, and I've I dragged the shadow a bit further into the environment, so she's casting even more of a shadow onto the ground, and then there's this secondary shadow in the deep foreground from something else in the environment that we can't see just yet. We can get to the final round of polishing, but this piece is almost complete as it is. I like the separation of the cool background, which is fairly desaturated, so the colors in the background are cooler and aren't as strong. There's not as much blue in the foreground as there is yellow. There's not as much blue in the background as there is yellow in the foreground. So the foreground colors are much more prominent, much more saturated, especially these little bursts of red. But all right, now that we've got the basic pattern down for the polishing, let's see what we can do to get a little bit more oomph. Drop in another screen layer again to strip away other colors, and I'm going to use another soft-edged brush here. It'll spill that color into the environment. So these hotspots are mostly areas on the figure that are pointed the most towards the main light source, which is coming from the left, and from the right-hand side of the frame and slightly from above. And I want to do a little splash of it with color first. You don't want to overuse white highlights when you're working with a robot, with any figure like this. As tempting as that can be, it can end up being a little bit too much like the Cylons from the original Battlestar Galactica in the 1970s. Very disco kind of highlights, which can work really well for some effects, and if that's what you're wanting, that's great. But if you're wanting a slightly more naturalistic look, then you want to be careful with how much of that you end up using. So now we have this very strong, warm light cast onto the main character. And because I brought in this much warmer light coming in off of the right-hand side of the frame, all the way to the main character, it's lighting up the main character as well, making her even more prominent. Without, and this is something you have to worry about if you're working with special effects, without erasing too much detail on the main character or on the environment. For instance, I absolutely would not want to erase the detail of the two signs back here. I want it to be very obvious that this is at Portage and Main, that we have the two signs for Portage Avenue and Portage Avenue East. The phone that's in her hand, I wonder about putting a light coming off of that as a light source, but only aimed at her. So the phone itself would block the light from the viewer, but there would still be a light burst around it. In which case, if I actually go back, create another layer back here, I can create just a bit of a light plume, a light bloom that's only coming from that phone and up, basically towards her eyes, because she's looking directly at it. So that would add a little bit more emphasis to that relationship between her face, between her eyes, and the phone. Yeah, and it doesn't erase any of the details on the sign behind her. And then add in one final layer. And we are now completed. In conclusion, that's my basic procedure, and some of the ideas as to why I go about painting from back to front in an illustration like this. In conclusion, let's recap all of this. We've gone over why it is that I paint from back to front, so that I can bring in those background elements into the foreground to affect the foreground images and the foreground story. But by leaving the foreground last, for me, it works to ensure that every element in the illustration seems like it's part of the same three-dimensional space. That she inhabits a sidewalk that is in front of a street, in front of these buildings, in front of this sky. That they don't seem like separate elements just dropped in place like a bunch of photographs or a bunch of cardboard cutouts. And then going over my various techniques about painting in the deep background, and actually some of the background painting darker, but knowing I'm going to be throwing in effects layers to push it back even further. That's one of the reasons why I kept using those screen foggy layers, to make sure that that gets pushed back even further, to fairly desaturate the background so it isn't as rich, so the colors aren't as rich in the background as they are in the foreground, which helps to separate the planes and push all the focus of the illustration onto the main character. As much as this illustration is about a character at the corner of Portage and Main in Winnipeg, fundamentally for me, it's always going to be about that character more than about the setting. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.